Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our lecture on ideation. We've looked at 3 different strategies for coming up with creative ideas, and now we'll be discussing our 4th. So let's recap where we are in the creative process. We've learned about the ordinary world and how part of the creative process is developing skills, developing habits, developing certain approaches to problems, certain ways of looking at things, because that allows us to be efficient thinkers. That also allows us to be stable and feel grounded. But of course, if you want to be creative, you have to venture out beyond that and answer the call to try something new, to try a different approach, to look for different solutions. When we answer the call, we eventually enter the sea of possibilities, and it's often hard to navigate through those waters of the unknown because we're often tied back to the ordinary world. So we have to somehow develop cognitive flexibility. And now, for many of us, this might be the hardest part of the creative process, and that's actually generating new ideas. Maybe for some of us, this might be the easiest part. Maybe you know some people that are easily able to come up with interesting ideas and insights and creative solutions. But for some of us, this might be the most difficult, and it's often mysterious. How is it that that person is able to come up with creative ideas and takes me, it's a little bit more difficult for me. Well, it turns out there are some strategies that we can implement to actively generate new ideas. This stage of the creative process is aspect we call the trials and tribulations of finding new ideas. And trials and tribulations refers to how in any creative process you're going to be in need of new perspectives because of obstacles, because of difficulties, because things don't go the way that they were planned, or you get stuck. But there are things that you can do actively to unstuck yourself, right? To generate ideas to overcome those obstacles. So this is referred to as ideation, the creation of new ideas. So to give us a sense for the 4th strategy, here's what I want to think about. I'd like you to think about designing a creative new pair of scissors. What sorts of ideas come to mind when you are thinking about creating a new or coming up with a creative new pair of scissors? And if you want, you can even try to sketch that out, or just identify in your mind's eye what that might look like. Maybe you played around with different design patterns on your scissors, or different colors on your scissors. Maybe played around with different images to add onto your pair of scissors to make them look more interesting or creative. Maybe some of you had in your head new materials through which to, or with which to create your pair of scissors. Maybe you decide to make them transparent, like those on the screen. But there is a limitation for a lot of us in how we think about this problem. There's a limitation on our access to creative ideas, and that limitation comes to us because of the way the question was framed, the way the scenario or the task was framed. So when I said to design a creative new pair of scissors, the word scissors usually brings up to people, or brings up for people, this sort of image, right, of a pair of scissors. That inherently limits us. And we start with that at our base, and for a lot of us, we can't go too far from that base of what scissors look like. Can you think of any other way of rephrasing or restating this task to be basically asking for, the similar thing, but if you were to reframe it, you might see it a little bit differently? Well, let's ask ourselves this question. What do scissors do? Like, what's the purpose of them? Well, one thing you could do with scissors is cut paper. Well, how about if we reframe the question in terms of cutting paper? Can you come up with a creative new way of cutting paper? Notice that some of you may no longer start with this image as your base. Some of you may have started with this image as your base, right? Do you have now access to new ideas in how you can design your creative pair of scissors? All right. Maybe some of you have this as your base with a little sliding blade. Or maybe some of you have this as your base, a single blade. Well, if you start here, with these sorts of ideas, don't you now have access to a lot more different possibilities than you did earlier when the task was simply phrased in terms of scissors? What if we phrased it differently again and asked for a creative way of cutting hair? Can you think of even more ideas? So this is referred to as reframing, right? The strategy is referred to as reframing. Reframing is to frame or express differently. So two different ways of looking at this strategy: to frame or express differently. And Albert Einstein was famous for using this strategy to come up with lots of creative insights into the fundamental nature of the universe. Einstein was quoted as saying, "If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on the solution, I would spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. For once I know the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes." What's he saying there? I would spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. If I could figure out a way to frame the question, state it in a way that allows me to get a different perspective than the one I currently have, playing around with those different frames of the question might be an easier way of getting me to the solution. So let's discuss this part, this express differently part of it all. To express differently, right? You're saying it differently, you're thinking about it differently in your head. Well, when you think and when you talk, you use words, right? So anytime you're thinking about a problem, you're often thinking about it in terms of language, in terms of words, but words are symbols that represent something, right? Like the word scissors. I mean, scissors can represent lots of things, things that cut hair, cut paper. They're symbolic. So maybe if you think about how you're expressing a problem to yourself or a scenario to yourself, you might want to ask yourself, is there another way of restating this? Can I use different metaphors, different symbols in my language? Because if I use different symbols, I might be able to access a different way of looking at this. Okay, one thing to realize then is that all of your assumptions, when we go back and take a look at our ordinary world, all of our assumptions are really based off the language we're using, right? And if we're stuck to one way of saying something or one way of thinking about it in our heads, then we're kind of limited to those assumptions. And the more ways we have to say something, the more ways we have to articulate something or to phrase the problem that we're dealing with in our own heads, well, then we're going to have access to more levels of meaning. And hopefully that gives us new perspectives to find new ideas. So if you remember this problem, right? A man is born in 1990 and dies in 2010, but is 35 years old when he dies. Could this have been expressed differently in a way that would have given you a different perspective? Well, sure. Instead of thinking of 1990 and 2010 because of the way it's phrased now as years, I mean, we could have phrased this in terms of, in the hospital, the man is born in 1990 and dies in 2010. And then you're more likely to see those numbers as room numbers because of the way this was expressed, right? Can you think about your career? How do you think about your career? What sort of language do you use to talk about a career and how to be successful in it in your head? What sorts of symbols and metaphors might be ingrained in you about how to think about doing well in your career? Right? If we could be aware of those and then change them, we might be able to access new ways of being successful. Well, for a lot of people, one major metaphor is, being successful, you have to climb the corporate ladder. Well, how might this perspective be limiting? Well, if you're climbing a corporate ladder, doesn't that mean the only way to be successful is to always move forward and higher in your status within whatever it is you're doing? Is that necessarily the case? Does a good life or a good career have to be one where you're continually trying to chase after the promotion or the new job title? Well, what else is going on here? If you're on a ladder is not the most stable thing, right? A ladder is very precarious. So maybe because of that metaphor, you might start to feel very uneasy and anxious about the stability of your career. Maybe you start to think of your career as something that you have to hold on to and be worried about, which then gives you stress and anxiety, which may make you not so good at whatever it is you're doing in your job. Well, what else is going on in a ladder here? Well, to say you have to climb the corporate ladder, you might get the sense that you have to go over people, go around people, or maybe even shove people out of the way in order for you to progress forward. Is that really the best way to think about a career? If we shift the metaphor a little bit, if you can rephrase this in a new way, you might be able to see careers differently. Maybe one in which it's not all about just always achieving something higher in status. Maybe you start to think about it as not something where you have to move people out of the way, but maybe rather something that requires collaboration, right? So metaphors and language can limit us. They formulate the assumptions we have of something. And if we can notice that and question them or come up with new metaphors, we might be able to see things differently. How about drugs? Do you have any metaphors or language that you often associate with drugs? Well, there's this idea that became popular in the 1980s, this war on drugs. And so people started to think about how, especially folks who suffer from addiction or have had their lives dramatically impacted negatively because of drug usage. We need to fix this somehow. So some people started to think about the way to fix this in terms of a war on drugs. Well, can you see how that metaphor might be limiting? Well, if you're having a war on drugs, then that means there's some enemy there. The drug must be an enemy. Is that necessarily the case? Are all drugs enemies? Could there be any problems if you think that way about drugs, especially if you're severely ill or suffering from a disease where a drug could cure you? If it's a war on drugs, then you have to fight something. Well, what's the purpose of this all? Isn't it to help people that are suffering? Is a war on something really the framework you want to think about, or the framework you want to use to think about how to help somebody? Somebody has an addiction, who are you fighting? Does having that sort of violent or confrontational sentiment about drugs really help you with your partner or your brother who's suffering through this? Does that really help you develop empathy and sympathy for them? Plus, who exactly are you fighting? One of the stuff a lot of people say, a lot of the reasons why we have a mass incarceration problem within the country is because of dramatic, over vigilant laws against drug usage and just simple drug possession, where people that break laws in terms of drug possession are put into prisons for long periods of time, sometimes even for life. And as a result, we have had this growing mass incarceration issue where a lot of our population are in jail and a lot of them are there for nonviolent crimes, and we spend a lot of money to keep them in there. Maybe a lot of that might stem from this attitude that stems from this metaphor, this language, and how we think about dealing with drug-related issues within the country. Could we rephrase this differently? Could we reframe it in a way that gives us the perspective on how to deal with the problem? How about money? What sort of language do you have or do you use when discussing money and how to attain more of it? As we're growing up, many of you may have been taught that money doesn't grow on trees. Okay, so what does that do for you if you have that framework? Well, I think the intention for a lot of us is that if you say money doesn't grow on trees, you might see that money doesn't just fall from the sky. You can't just pick. I'll see if we can pick a leaf. You can't just pick the dollar bill or $100 bill as easily as you pick leaves from a tree, right? You have to work at it. I think this is the sense. So a metaphor like this might give you that impression. But what if we flip this on its head? What if we said, no, money does grow on trees? What kind of perspective does that give you on money, perhaps, to say money does grow on trees? Well, wait a minute. If money grows on trees, that means that it grows. So maybe that gives you a sense that wealth has to develop over time, like trees grow over time. Could that be a useful perspective? But what's needed for the trees to grow? Well, it needs to be nurtured, it needs to be watered in order for it to grow. Well, might that be useful to think about in terms of how you can grow wealth, that you need to nurture it, that you need to water it, you need to put effort over time, consistently, in order for your wealth to grow? All right. New metaphor changes our perspective on something. gives us a new idea. How about life? How do you think about your life? What sorts of words and stories do you tell yourself about what life is about and how to have a good one? What to expect out of it, right? Can you think of any metaphors people have shared with you about life that may have given you insight on it? All right. One of the more famous ones, right, is this metaphor: life is like a box of chocolates. You'll never know what you'll get. Well, how does that shape the way you think about life? Well, to say life is like a box of chocolates, let's think about the chocolates in a box of chocolates. Some of them are sweet, some of them are bitter, some of them are nutty, some of them are smooth. Isn't that kind of what life is like? Sometimes life is super sweet, and sometimes it's kind of bitter. Sometimes it's really crazy and nutty, and sometimes life is just rather smooth. It's nice and goes along well for you. I mean, within this metaphor, we have this sense now, this felt sense that life is unpredictable. It has ups and downs. That it's a variety of experiences. Life isn't just roses all the time, right? Or life is full of different types of experiences that some we like, some that we don't. All, right? This perspective all comes from a simple metaphor. Life is like a box of chocolates. Can you think of other metaphors you can use to get a better or different perspective on life? In fact, you could probably make stuff up, right? Just look around you and pick any item, pick anything to be a metaphor for life. How about riding a bicycle? How might life be like riding a bicycle? It might be hard at first, but with practice, you'll find your balance. Or life is like a photograph. How might life be like a photograph? Well, maybe life is about making memories that you can keep. Life is full of moments that are special and memorable, right? I mean, you can come up with any sort of metaphor you like, and the point isn't to be right or wrong. The point is to gain a new insight on whatever it is you are looking at. Okay, let's try this for yourselves. If you are working for a car company and I asked you to design a creative new car, right? Because of the way this is framed, your initial basis, how you're thinking about this, might be, four wheels, some doors, a windshield. How could we reframe this to give us a new perspective on it? Well, let's go back to purpose again. What's the purpose of a car? Well, transportation. Okay. Can you design a new creative mode of transportation? Can you feel how that opens you up to more ideas than just four wheels? Right? Maybe two wheels, maybe one wheel, maybe no wheels, maybe it's a hovercraft. Design a creative new way of getting to New York from LA. Well, instead of car now, you might think of aircraft or train or underground tunnel, all simply because of the way we reframed the problem. If you work for a drug company and I asked you, hey, find a new cancer drug, how might you reframe the problem to see alternative solutions or new ideas? Well, again, let's return to purpose. What's the purpose of a cancer drug? Well, hopefully it's to relieve the suffering of people who have cancer. Well, what if we reframed the question that way? Find a new way of alleviating suffering of people who are suffering from cancer? Well, then now instead of drugs, you might be thinking about different types of therapies, music therapies, or we might be thinking about setting up social structures where patients or people that suffer from cancer are interacting with certain other people to help them deal with their suffering. Right? Again, all these alternatives, the result of simply reframing what you are trying to do. And of course, we could have easily done this for the paper airplane exercise, right? And by saying design a new paper airplane or design a paper airplane, I could have reframed this differently. Or you could have reframed this differently to come up with new ideas for your design. So what does the airplane do? Well, it goes through the air. So design a new way for paper to go through the air. How much easier would it have been to come up with more creative solutions if you had thought of that? Design a new way for paper to travel furthest in the air. So reframing is a very powerful tool. So it's a tool I'd like you to think about for your 5-year goals. Can you reframe ways in which you think you're supposed to achieve your 5-year goals? Can you restate your strategy in a way that may give you a different insight on how to attain them? Or even better, can you reframe your goals? Can you restate them differently? For some of our goals that you wrote about for your assignments in class, you had some details like I'm going to lose 20 pounds within 5 years. I want to have this much salary within 5 years. Well, how might you reframe those sorts of goals? Well, let's go back to purpose again. What would be the purpose of losing the 20 pounds within 5 years? Is it to look a certain way? Is it to have certain numbers in terms of blood pressure or cholesterol? Right? Well, if you thought about your goal in those different frameworks, might you have new ideas on how to achieve your goal? Right? So try to implement reframing for your 5-year goals. The second part of the reframing, right, is the frame component. We just talked about the expressive. How about to frame differently? Well, to frame differently means to find a new context, right? A new perspective on something. So what does context refer to? I mean, like right now, these trees, is it these? I think it's more than one. This tree is my context because it's the background. It is the background through which or by which you're able to see me, right? Is what surrounds me. This all provides the context for what you see, right? So the definition of context is the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, idea, object, etc., that help give it meaning. Okay, so if I told you something like Joe smells good, would you know what I mean? Would you know what I mean? You might think you do, but you really don't because you don't have the full context. You don't know the whole background story. You don't have the trees in the background that show you that there's a person here, right? By the way, because if I just went straight up to the camera and all you saw was my forehead, then there's no context, right? There's no background to distinguish me from. So you wouldn't know what you're looking at if you just stared at a dot by forehead. So without the context for the statement, Joe smells good, you don't really know what we're referring to. Do we mean Joe has a pleasant odor? He put on some cologne today, or he took a bath, so he has pleasant odor? Well, he could. Or it could mean Joe's nose works really well because he could smell good, right? Like maybe Joe's a boxer and he got hit in the nose and he wasn't able to smell roses for a while, but now he can smell good. How would you know the difference? Well, you need the whole story. You need the background, right? You need the context. If I gave you a different context to understand this scenario, if I said, hey, so we're at this hospital, right? And we're seeing all these people getting born in the pregnancy area. And there's a guy, he was born in 1990 and dies in 2010, but is 35 years old when he dies. Might that maybe give you a better chance of seeing 1990 and 2010 as hospital room numbers by changing the context? Okay, so let's look at some examples. If you are a creative artist drawing a painting somehow, and you're stuck with where you are in the painting, how might you change the context? How might you reframe it so that you can see it differently and maybe come up with a new idea? Well, maybe if you're in your room looking at the painting, right, where your white walls are the background, how about taking your painting outdoors? Can you see that? Outdoors, right? And then as you're looking at your painting, you have these trees in the background. That might cause you to see your painting differently. Right? Or how about if you're in your room and have to be there? How about just changing the lighting in your room? Right? That lighting context might change the way you see your painting and maybe give you a new idea. What about just turning your painting upside down? Right? That changes the context by which you're looking at the painting. And that might give you a new idea of what to add next. How about literally changing the frame in which the painting is in? Maybe changing that frame, literally changing that outline will make the painting look a little bit different to you. And then you might have a new idea with which to continue your painting. How about with music? What if you are a songwriter and you want to come up with a creative new idea for a song? What could you do to change the context? Well, I mean, if you're a songwriter, you're usually basically thinking about your melody and then your lyrics. And maybe you start off with a country song, but to reframe it could be to change that background of that song. And instead of having it with a typical country sort of accompaniment, you put it into some sort of hip hop accompaniment, right? All of a sudden, basically the same song, but with a different context, and you have a new idea for a song. One of my students told me to listen to this song, Thrift Shop by Macklemore, and said that there was an interesting version from another group and that they reframed Macklemore's version to come up with a new song. Okay, so let's listen a little bit to Macklemore's version of the song.
What, 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 what,
I'm gonna pop some tags. Only got $20 in my pocket. I'm hunting, looking for a come up. This is fucking awesome.
Nah, walk into the club like, what up? I got a big cock. I'm just pumped. I bought some shit from a thrift shop. Ice on the fringe is so damn frosty. The people like,
Damn, that's a cold ass honky.
rolling in hella deep, headed to the mezzanine. Dressed in all pink, set my gator shoes. Those are green, draped in a leopard mink. Girl standing next to me. Probably should've washed this. Smells like R. Kelly sheets. Piss.
And there's another group, a postmodern jukebox, and they basically take the same song and they're going to reframe it, right? They're going to place it into a new genre. Let's take a listen.
I'm gonna pop some tags. Only got $20 in my pocket. I'm hunting, looking for a come up. This is freaking awesome. Walking through the club like, what up? I'm such a big shot. I'm so pumped about some swag from the thrift shop. Ice on the fringe, it's so damn frosty that people like, damn, that's a cold ass honky. Rolling hella deep, heading to the mezzanine. Dressed on pink, set my gator shoes, those are green. Draped in a leopard mink, girl standing next to me. Probably should've washed this 'cause it smells like R. Kelly sheets.
So do you see how that is making use of reframing? You can take a song and put it into a different context, different background accompaniment, and make it feel like a new song. How about for stories? If you'd written a story in the past, could you reframe it in a way that you have an idea for a new type of story? Well, how might reframing look for stories? Well, remember, we're talking about changing context. So maybe you take your story that's set in the mountains, right, of India, and then you place the exact same story within, a balcony in San Jose, right? You literally change the setting. Or maybe you take a story that you wrote about modern times and you place it into the far future. Same story, but you just change the context, and all of a sudden you have a new idea. And a famous example of this is Romeo and Juliet. Here we have a story about star-crossed lovers, right? One person from one group and another person from another group, and they fall in love. Medieval times, a classic love tale. And it's retold, right, over and over again. And one of the more famous retellings of this was in West Side Story, where they take the same story. Instead of medieval times, we have rival gangs in New York. In fact, a lot of people claim that most stories we hear of, most stories we see in movies and TV shows, are just the retelling of old stories, many of which come from Shakespeare and maybe a religious text like the Bible, but they're retold over and over again in new packaging, right? New contexts. And they may feel different and fresh as a result. Could you do something like this for your own writing? How might you change the context for yourself? Children do this naturally, don't they? They'll go in the backyard and look at rocks and twigs and leaves, and they'll put them into new contexts. Instead of just thinking about them in the context of, living plants, they'll put them into the context of family. So then a bunch of rocks become a family. Or in terms of skyscrapers, and then you stack up some twigs and become skyscrapers, right? They reframe how they look at these objects. I mean, you might have been with a kid while they're eating, dinner, and they're playing with their food. Well, pay close attention to how they're playing. They might be using reframing and taking advantage of their creativity to come up with the really interesting ideas of what's on their plate. Right? Instead of grapes in the context of eating, or broccoli or string beans within the context of eating, they've put them in the context of body parts. And now they have a new idea of how to think about these food items. Einstein, as I mentioned, was famous for reframing problems, and one of the things that came out of his practice of reframing was the theory of special relativity. And special relativity changed the way we looked at the cosmos and gravity and time and motion. It's because of special relativity that we realized that our notions of time weren't really accurate. Now, for most of us, we have the sense that time is constant, right? No matter who you are and where you are in the world. Like if you're wherever you are and your brother or your mom is someplace else, that when 1 second passes for you, they're going to experience the passage of 1 second the same way, right? So if you drop your mom off at her house and then go back to your house, if your watch says 5 minutes have passed since you left your mom's place, your mom's watch at the exact same time should also say 5 minutes, right? If you decide to fly to go visit your aunt in Boston, and your mom's looks at her watch when you land, the amount of time that passes for your mom should be the same as the amount of time that passes for you, right? According to you, if it takes you 5 hours, right, from when you left the airport to land in Boston, then according to your mom, if she took a look at her watch, when you landed, it would have been 5 hours since you had left. Einstein's theory tells us that's not true. That time is not constant. That time, the passage of time, depends on motion. So that if you're on a plane, right, and it feels like to you a certain amount of time has passed, the time that you land and the time that your loved one looks at their watch, the passage of time isn't exactly the same. And there have been experiments done with this, with atomic clocks, where one has been on a plane, another one's been on the ground. They start at the same time, and then the one on the plane goes around the Earth, and then it lands, and then they look at the two watches, and they're no longer in sync. Because, according to Einstein, movement changes the passage of time. Craziness. Well, this is a physics question, right? This is a physics law. Um, so, this is the language normally of physicists, mathematical symbols. Einstein reframed this. Instead of thinking about the problem using the normal language of mathematical symbols, he thought in his head about what it would look like and feel like to ride a beam of light. So he took it out of the context of mathematical symbols, put it into the context of the experience of riding a beam of light. And as a result, he came up with this crazy idea about time and how gravity works and how motion works. Can you see how companies reframe their products to be able to create new products? Right? Maybe you can think of how they literally reframe it by changing the packaging. But how about reframing it? Like what their item is, how might they reframe that in a completely different context? Well, how about if we package this as a health drink? Is there any way we can repackage Coca-Cola as a health drink and put it into a context of the health food industry? Well, I mean, Coke does have something that's healthier than Coca-Cola. Right? The company produces Dasani. And what is Dasani? Dasani, if you take a look at the packaging, you take a look at the commercials, you might get the sense that Dasani is like this pure water that flows from the mountaintops, pure spring water from a glacier. Well, in fact, Dasani water is actually Coca-Cola without the syrup. Right? They basically reframed Coca-Cola as a health drink by removing the syrup. New context for the product. Right? Instead of this product that's supposed to be full of sugar and it's supposed to taste good to you, right? They reframe that product as something that's supposed to be good for your body. New context. Same product. And in fact, there's less stuff in this, right? Because there's less sugar, less syrup, which costs more. It's Dasani. Take a look at the back of the bottle to see where it's from. It's from the same place that your Coke comes from, not some glacier, right? Companies come up with clever ways of making new products with their same manufacturing lines by reframing. Can you do this for your business idea? Think about an apple. What's the normal thing people do with apples? Well, you might use apples to, just eat the apple. You might use apples to make apple pie. You might create apple sauce with apples. Can you think of other ideas for what to do with apples? Okay, well, let's try reframing. Let's try different contexts besides eating. What might a policeman do with an apple? Throw it. You might. What might a jockey, right? Somebody that's riding a horse at a horse race. What might a jockey do with an apple? How could he make use of that besides eating it? What might a science teacher? How might they use the apple? That's different than the norm. Can you see how by changing the context, we can maybe get access to new ideas for what to do with an apple? Recall this example of a past student for their final project, right? They created different type of jewelry, but remember how they did it. On close inspection, we see that they used bottle tabs. So they reframed how they looked at the bottle tabs. Instead of it just being the tab of a soda can or a beer can, they thought of it in terms of components to making jewelry. You can think of this as repurposing the item, right? We can think of this as we reframe the way we see this thing being used. Okay? Or think about the glue stick for the paper airplane exercise. Right? Normal world of glue sticks, well, you glue stuff with it. How about if we reframed it in terms of the body of the airplane? Not just to put stuff together, but something that gives something weight, like your paper airplane. So think about any problem you might be facing, any problems that you're dealing with. Can you think of a way of reframing the problem? Maybe it's a problem you have with your parents or your kids or your boss. Can you restate it or put it into a new context that might give you a different angle, a different way of approaching the problem? How about your final projects? How might you reframe in order to come up with new ideas for your projects? New ideas on how to make your project, or even new ideas on what your project should be, right? So when we come back, we're going to take a look at our last strategy, and we'll wrap up we'll summarize the entire fourth aspect.